So Paley strays from the systems of interacting components and talks about arrangements that simply fit his idea of the way things ought to be. So his arguments would have been much more improved if he had said far less. Unfortunately, Paley had exposed himself to refutation by overstating points and digressing from his main argument. So Behe says that poor Paley, his modern opponents feel justified in assuming enormously complex starting points, such as a watch or a retina, if they think that they can then explain a simple improvement, such as watch cover or curvature of the eye. Now, these two features, watch cover and curvature of eye, Darwinists explain by offering several stories to account for this peripheral features. For example, Darwinian explanation for a watch with a cover may start by assuming that there is a factory that already exists that makes watches without covers. And then what Darwinists would do is they would explain by giving examples of how that watch will improve, or how that cover on the watch will improve over time. But what they will never offer is how did that cover get there in the first place. So that's why Behe states that no further arguments are made, no explanation is given for the real complexity, which is known as the irreducible complexity. The refutations of Paley's overreaching is asserted to be a refutation of Paley's main point, even by those who know better. So the Paley's peripheral points are refuted by neo-Darwinists, and then they consider that the main argument's been refuted. So because of Paley's indiscretion and carelessness, that he spoke about arrangements that simply fitted his idea of the way things ought to be, rather than addressing the systems of necessarily interacting components, Paley's arguments have now over many years turned into straw man for Darwinists to knock down. Now, just as arguments for intelligent design have been around for a long time, arguments against intelligent design likewise have been around for a very long time too. Here is a Scottish philosopher, David Hume, who argued against design before Darwin and his successors in a book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which was published after his death in 1779 by his nephew. But the question many intelligent design proponents ask is that, did Hume successfully refute intelligent design theory? Well, if we analyze Hume's argument against design, what we find is that his argument doesn't refute intelligent design theory, rather it criticizes a particular type of logic, the logic of using design as a positive evidence for the existence of God. But the modern intelligent design theory doesn't make such a claim. Modern intelligent design theory doesn't claim to prove the existence of God. It claims to detect design, and it claims to be a scientific theory, and makes it's neutral with regards to any theological commitments. So Hume didn't really offer any alternative explanation for complex biological design, which even many ardent neo-Darwinists accept. Rather, he just criticized the logic that's used by the proponents of design argument of his time, which was to use it as a positive evidence for the existence of God. But the design argument, in the modern design argument, has evolved to a more sophisticated version, which doesn't make a positive case for the existence of God, rather it makes a positive case for the detection of design in nature. So Dawkins is not convinced that Hume had disposed of argument for intelligent design theory. In his book called The Blind Watchmaker, Dawkins recalls a dinner conversation with a well-known atheist philosopher, and he describes that conversation by saying that I said that I could not imagine being an atheist at any time before 1859, when Darwin's Origin of Species was published. So he gives less importance to David Hume, and he gives more importance to Darwin for allowing him to be intellectually fulfilled atheist. What about Hume, replied the philosopher. How did Hume explain the organized complexity of the living world, I asked. Now here you can see that Dawkins is accepting that living world is very well organized in terms of its complexity. So he's not denying that. This is where Dawkins and Paley share their commitments. He didn't, said the philosopher. Why does it need any special explanation? In other words, the philosopher believes that criticizing the logic of using intelligent design as a positive evidence for the existence of God is enough to refute design argument. Now, this is based on a confusion. This is based on a misunderstanding that modern intelligent design argument makes a claim for the existence of God, because in reality, such a claim doesn't exist in the modern intelligent design argument. Yes, the two arguments can be bridged. William Dembski has written a book about bridging between science and theology and modern intelligent design argument being a good argument for such a bridging. But that doesn't make intelligent design argument an argument for the existence of God. It's neutral with regards to such a case. So you don't need to provide, according to, so the modern intelligent design argument is not refuted by David Hume's thinking and criticism. So the philosopher believes that you don't need to provide alternatives merely by criticizing the logic of using design argument as a positive argument for existence of God is enough. But Richard Dawkins isn't convinced, because he very well knows that modern intelligent design theory isn't about proving the existence of God. Now, Dawkins goes on to express this concern, and he writes that, as for David Hume himself, it is something said that that great Scottish philosopher disposed of the argument from design a century before Darwin. But what Hume did was criticize the logic of using apparent design in nature as positive evidence for the existence of God. He did not offer an alternative explanation for complex biological design. So Dawkins is unsatisfied with Hume's argument against design. So here is a modern philosopher, Elliot Solber of University of Wisconsin. And in his book called Philosophy of Biology, he explains Hume's reasoning for us in some detail and writes, Hume believes we must ask how similar watches and organisms really are. A moment's reflection shows that they are very dissimilar. Watches are made of glass and metal. They do not breathe, excrete, metabolize, or reproduce. The immediate consequence of course, is that the design argument is a very weak analogy argument. It is preposterous to infer that organisms have a given property simply because watches happen to have it. So Sober is complaining here about analogy between watches and organisms, because this is a disanalogy. They do not match in terms of a lot of features such as breathing, excreting, metabolizing, reproducing. So Sober is not arguing for David Hume. He's arguing against the analogy between watches and organisms. So just like Dawkins, Sober does not agree with Hume either. He writes that although Hume's criticism is devastating if the design argument is an argument from analogy. So he says if the design argument is an argument from analogy. So he doesn't agree that the design argument is an argument from analogy. He goes on saying that I see no reason why the design argument must be construed in this way, as in be seen as an argument from analogy. Doesn't agree with Hume on this. Paley's argument about organisms stands on its own, regardless of whether watches and organisms happen to be similar. The point of talking about watches is to help the reader see that the argument about organisms is compelling. In other words, what Sober is saying is that David Hume thought that the design argument depended on a close proximity in accidental details of biological organisms to the other design objects, such as watch, which he uses in his book. And that's because David Hume believed that design argument is an argument from analogy. Sober thinks Hume's line of thinking was wrong because such a line of thinking would destroy all analogies, because any two non-identical objects will differ in more ways than they are similar. For example, by Hume's thinking, you cannot make an analogy between cars and aeroplanes because of their non-identical nature. Even though both car and aeroplanes both are devices of transportation, and someone may make such an analogy, but according to Hume's thinking, such analogy is invalid because Hume will just dismiss such analogy, saying that aeroplane has wings and car doesn't have wings, and so forth. So Sober is not agreeing with Hume on this issue. He doesn't agree that design argument is an argument from analogy. And he also criticizes the way David Hume puts forward the argument from analogy, because the way he does it, no analogy can be considered valid. So Sober's thinking is that intelligent design argument is an inference to the best explanation and not an argument from analogy as Hume thinks. And before Darwin, between competing explanation of intelligent design versus unguided natural forces, Paley's argument was more likely. So that's Sober's thinking. So firstly, what he's saying is he's rejecting Hume's thinking and accepts intelligent design as inference to the best explanation rather than an analogy, which is being twisted by Hume out of shape in order to refute or undermine William Paley. So Sober doesn't agree. And secondly, Sober believes that if a choice had been made between William Paley's inference to the best explanation and the unguided natural forces that had been known before Darwin arrived on the scene, Paley would have won the debate because his was the best explanation available before Darwin. So what Sober is precisely saying is, up until Darwin's time, William Paley had the upper hand, and Hume's argument doesn't work against him because William Paley didn't make an argument from analogy. But after Darwin, Sober accepts Darwin to have the better explanation than William Paley. So here is Michael Behe, who still believes that argument from analogy between mechanical and living system would still be valid, even though he accepts that intelligent design is an inference to the best explanation. But he also accepts that there is a possibility that if you take the intelligent design as an argument from analogy, that it still would hold as a valid argument, because he believes that modern biochemistry and molecular sciences are capable of making watches or timekeeping devices out of biological materials. If not now, then certainly in the near future, the modern science will be able to do that, because Behe points out that there are many biochemical systems that are capable of timekeeping. He gives one example in his book on Darwin's black box about proteins that tell you when the cell needs to divide. So there are certain proteins that operate during cell division, and they are very good at timekeeping. Moreover, he gives another example where biochemical gears and chains and feedback mechanisms exist in the cells, which Behe refers to as nanomachines, and he believes that these nanomachines are capable of providing biological material which is necessary to produce mechanical devices such as watches. So Behe believes that argument from analogy is not invalid, because organisms and the devices such as watches, analogy between two is valid based on our modern experience of biochemistry and molecular sciences. So he says, Hume's criticism of design argument that asserts a fundamental difference between mechanical systems and living systems is out of date, destroyed by the advance of science, which has discovered the machinery of life. So you have nanomachines inside the cell, which mimic and which are analogous to the machinery of a working watch. So Behe believes that such an analogy is not invalid. During William Paley's time or during David Hume's time, such an analogy was invalid because the science hadn't advanced enough. But today, we know that such machinery does exist within the cell, which Behe calls Darwin's black box. So analogy from argument from analogy is also valid, just like inference to the best explanation is. So here Sober continues his analysis of Hume's argument, and he says, I now turn to Hume's second criticism of design argument, which is no more successful than the first. So again, he's making a case against David Hume's line of thinking. Hume contends that if we are to have good reason to think that the organisms in our world are the products of intelligent design, then we must have looked at lots of other worlds and observed intelligent design and producing organisms there. So here, Hume is criticizing design as an inductive argument. So because we haven't seen designers, or we haven't seen designers operating in this world or the other world, therefore, he believes that there is a problem of induction here. So Hume is criticizing intelligent design argument and saying it makes finite observations from which then it makes a universal claim, a generalized claim. So he thinks that since we never observed this designing agent in our world, we must look to other worlds for such an experience about intelligent designer. But because we have no access to other worlds, we have no experience to make such an induction in the first place. Now, Sober is criticizing this. He doesn't agree, and he believes that this argument is no more successful than his first argument against intelligent design, which was, the argument from analogy. Now, here is argument from induction. So both these arguments don't work against intelligent design. That's what Sober is saying. So Sober's thinking is Hume's argument is invalid because intelligent design is an inference to the best explanation. It is not an inductive argument. But Behe again believes that Sober could have extended his argument against Hume and gone further here in rejecting Hume's objections to the inductive argument. Because for Behe, inductive argument can work, just like the analogy argument was working for him. I want to point out here that Behe accepts intelligent design as an inference to best explanation, but he's also saying that even if you were to pose the intelligent design as an argument from induction using watches, it's valid, and it's also valid as an argument and as an inductive argument. So as an analogy as well as inductive argument, both types of arguments are valid here. So he writes that modern biochemistry routinely designs biochemical systems which are now known to be the basis of life. Therefore, we do have experience in observing the intelligent design of components of life. So Hume is saying that we never get to see the designing agent, so we have to look for them in the other worlds. And because we don't have access to other worlds, therefore, we don't have a valid reason to make this induction. Whereas B is saying that we do have experience of intelligent designers, because in our modern time, biochemistry can show, or molecular genetics shows how certain scientists, they can artificially design certain biological entities in their laboratories, like the fruit, the extra set of wings in a fruit fly. So this argument no longer stands, although in Hume's time he was right in thinking that we never get to observe the designer, we never get to observe the designing agent, the one who designs the basis of life in our world, so we must look in other worlds. B is saying we do get to experience the designing agents, the agents who design the basis of life in our world, because many times in the genetic labs or in other fields of science which work in the molecular level, scientists are able to generate certain features of life artificially, and therefore Hume's argument breaks down. So in summary, the philosopher friend of Richard Dawkins, who thought that David Hume had refuted the argument from design, had erred in his opinion both in philosophy and science. Whereas Elliot Sober is more successful as a philosopher by understanding that intelligent design is an argument from analogy or induction. Rather, it is an inference to the best explanation. But Elliot Sober is unaware of the developments in science and therefore doesn't extend his argument against Hume's outdated thinking. So had he extended it, he would have also accepted that induction is valid as well as analogy is valid with the watch. So although Sober agrees that Hume was incorrect, he still remains unsympathetic to modern intelligent design argument because he believes that after Darwin's arrival, intelligent design argument falls apart because Darwin provides a valid mechanism for how evolution of life works. So intelligent design, he refutes based on that idea, but he accepts that David Hume didn't do a very good job in refuting William Paley on design argument. And it is this failure of David Hume's arguments against intelligent design which has caused many modern advocates to advance other rationales for their views and not regurgitate David Hume's arguments. So for that reason, I conclude that David Hume's arguments are outdated and they cannot be used as to refute the modern theory of intelligent design.